to this talk, and I think it's also a good time to remember Ambassador Lutem and his commitment to his work, his commitment to his ideas, his friendship, and also his great sense of humor, which I always appreciated. So when you write a story, when you tell a story, when you write a history, the significant thing is where to start. And there could be many starts to the history I've written, but I'll just pick one of them out. And that is the lunch I had with
I'm sorry,
Stanford
can I just make a short announcement?
Yes?
If you have any questions,
yes.
Can you please type them in the chat section and send it to Center for Eurasian Studies, AVİM. When you send those questions to us, we will, by the end of Professor Salt's lecture, we will read the questions to Professor Salt. Thank you. Go ahead, Professor Salt.
Yes, anyway, so the starting point of this book, in a way, or one starting point, was a lunch I had with Stanford Shaw. Stanford had been a professor at the University of California and came to Bilkent, and we became friends. I would have lunch with Stanford, and he was a very special person, very, very friendly, very approachable, very down to earth, and very prodigious in the output. He wrote many books as well as his articles. So I was having lunch with Stanford one day at Bilkent, and I said to him, because I was very curious about this, I'd gone to bookshops, and my interest in Ottoman history had mainly been confined to the 19th century. When I came to Turkey, or after I came to Turkey, it moved on to the early 20th century. And when I looked at the war, what happened during the First World War, I would go to the bookshops. I'd see any number of books on military campaigns and what happened at Gallipoli, what happened at Kut, what happened at Sarıkamış, biographies of the generals, so forth and so on. But I would see literally nothing about what happened to the civilian population. So over lunch one day, I said to Stanford knowing many things of which I had no idea, Stanford, I'm very curious about this. How can I find out what happened to the civilian population in the Ottoman Empire? And Stanford looked at me and said, well, you're not going to find much. And of course, then I quickly understood from his explanation that one reason was that there's a very high level of illiteracy in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, probably close to 80 or 90% actually, in the eastern provinces anyway. And people were not able to record what they had been through. And the military officers, who were better able to tell what they'd been through, who were educated, they were mainly concerned with campaigns and the military situation, which is not to say that their writings and their diaries didn't include references to what happened to the civilians and what was going on in the villages through which they passed. But the point Stanford was making was that there's nothing much readily available. Now, the point here is that if you wanted to write a book about civilian suffering in the First World War, you could write any series of monographs. You could go into the archives, which of course I'm not trained to do. I'm not an Ottoman scholar. I'm a bit of a dilettante. And you could write a whole book, a whole monograph on, for example, food supplies, or the health situation, or transport. There's no end to the number of books you could produce on how the civilians passed through the First World War. But that was not the kind of book I wanted to write. I wanted to write an overview because for many years, I had been reading these books coming out of the United States and out of Britain, which really had very little about the general suffering of the Ottoman civilian population, and they were not satisfactory at all from my point of view. So my idea was to write an overview aimed mainly at a Western readership, not a Turkish readership primarily, although I hope Turkish readers would get something out of my book, because I don't want to be in the position of talking to Turks about their own history. I'm sure they know it much better than I do. So the target audience was a Western audience, and I was set out to do my best to compress what I found into one book, despite the immense material eventually I was able to find. So the second question was how to go about this. Where should I start? What would be necessary to understand what happened in the First World War. Because to look at the war itself, just 1914 to 1918, obviously would not be sufficient. I needed to look at the background. And I think only by looking at the background could the reader understand what happened and what happened in the First World War. So here is another starting point. How far should I go into the background, into the history, to explain what happened in the First World War? Well, the starting point I chose was the War of 1877-78, the Doksan Uçar. Because it seems to me that those 50 years from that period on to the end of the First World War form a pretty coherent, integrated history of decline. There's no recovery in those 50 years. And if we look at what happened up to that point, the 77-78 war was the last one of a whole series of wars that the Ottoman Empire had fought during the 19th century. And it was the one that really was like an axe blow that was laid at the trunk of the Ottoman Empire. And it was such a heavy blow, it never really recovered from that war. And it was a slow downhill slide until the First World War. So that was my starting point. And I thought that if I wanted to understand the war in those 50 years, I needed to understand a lot of things. I needed to understand the structural nature of the empire. I needed to understand finances. I needed to understand demographics. I needed to understand center-periphery relations. I needed to have some grasp of provincial administration. I needed to know a little bit about development and undevelopment. I need to know about military capacity and relations with other states. I need to know about uprisings. I needed to know about social conditions, health, transport, so forth and so on. I need to know about the differences between the East and the West, Eastern Anatolia and Western Anatolia. An enormous amount I needed to get my head around as well as I could, although it was never going to be complete, before I started to write this book. So I begin the book by looking at the financial situation in the empire, and here I relied very heavily on people like Şevket Pamuk and other authors who had concentrated on Ottoman finances. And if we look at the financial situation throughout the 20th century, we see the Ottoman government perennially on a high wire balancing act, trying to make finances work and sequentially failing whatever they were doing. They simply, the wars that the Ottoman Empire had fought, one after the other, had completely debilitated the state, had cost it revenue, had put into debt with wartime indemnities, so forth and so on. So the struggle to maintain finances was a chronic one from the beginning of the 19th century to the end. And how the empire coped with this was by introducing a paper currency, the KMA, that this was in the first one was in the 1840s, which no one trusted, by debasing the currency, by reducing the number of metal in the currency, copper and silver. None of this worked. The Ottoman population, generally speaking, lost trust, had no trust in paper money, and even metal coinage lost its value rapidly over time. If we look, for example, at the metal currency, even by 1834, metal currency had lost its value, 80% of its value, its purchasing power over the previous 3 decades. So if we just look at the finances from the period I've chosen to start the book with, from the 1870s onwards, but even before that, what we see is this continuing spiral downwards of the empire unable to get its finances in order, and unable to secure an adequate supply of money to pay its costs. If we look, for example, at the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, it precipitated a wave of borrowing by the government on the European money market. The first one borrowed the first loan taken at that time was £8 million, but only to be used for war costs. In 1861, the government set out to borrow 400 million lira Fortunately, that loan did not go through because after commissions and interest, it would have returned less than 165 million lira to the Ottoman government. By 1874, I use these figures to give some idea of what was going on. By 1874, the government had borrowed more than 238 million lira, which in today's currency translates to about more than 200 million pounds sterling, but had received less than half that after commissions and other costs. In 1875, the government had annual revenue of 25 million lira, but was obliged to pay 30 million towards its foreign debt. This led to default on loan repayments, and effectively it led to insolvency. The distrust of Ottoman finances and the loan situation was so great by 1877 that an attempt in that year to raise a loan of £5 million in London was taken up only to the extent of £3,520. No one trusted the Ottoman government anymore because it was not able to repay its loans on time. The 1877-78 war greatly worsened the situation. It was, as I have said, it was a terrible blow, possibly the worst blow the Ottoman state had suffered at that time in its history up to that time. It greatly worsened the situation, and by 1879, the government was already leasing tax revenue from a number of products, including salt, tobacco, silk, fish, and so on to foreign interests. Now, this foreshadowed the decree of Muharrem in 1881, when the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, which put an even greater amount of Ottoman revenue under the control of foreign governments. Now, what did all of this mean? What did the lack of ready cash mean? It meant, first of all, that the government couldn't pay its overseas debts. It couldn't even pay by 1881 or the late 1870s. It couldn't even pay the interest on outstanding interest. So that was the foreign situation. Internally, it couldn't pay salaries. It couldn't pay its soldiers on time. It couldn't pay civil servants on time. The central questions here, I think, to be asked, the ones that are very important to me, is that how does a government govern without an adequate supply of money? You can have the best ideas in the world. You can have all the reforms you want on paper to set up a much more efficient public administration, particularly in the eastern provinces where administration was notoriously kind of inefficient. If you don't have money, how do you govern? How do you introduce reforms? You simply can't do it. So that was the two main conclusions that I came to after looking at Ottoman finances. The second chapter is taking up with trying to look at patterns of development and undevelopment, particularly the comparisons to be made between the Western Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and the Aegean coast region, and the eastern provinces. Now, money was to be made. Where money was to be made, you could attract foreign investors. So if you wanted ports, develop ports, railways, and so forth, people were prepared to put money into this infrastructure because there's going to be some return for them. There's also a developing European appetite for travel to Constantinople and to Palestine. And this enhanced the construction of railways. Of course, the most famous one we all know about is the Orient Express. There was money to be made for foreign investors who were prepared to put their money into building railways to Constantinople. So there's a heavy railway development through the Balkans to Istanbul, and some railway development down the Aegean coast and a little bit into the interior, but not much beyond that. And there's nothing in the east because there's no money for anyone who would invest in railways in the east. The government couldn't do it, and Russia itself was not prepared to countenance railway development in provinces close to its border. So there was development in the West to a certain degree, increasingly throughout the 19th century, kind of infrastructural development, but none at all in the eastern provinces. No railways, no made roads, only wagon tracks from the inland to the coast, few bridges, few hospitals, no clinics. I mean, all the basic facilities you would think of when you talk about modern life were absent from the eastern provinces, and you had a mostly illiterate population. So in that part of the empire, in fact, from the central Anatolian provinces to the east, the daily problems of life were intermittent. Such things as drought and famine would recur time and time again. I'll give you a couple of examples of how difficult life could be, particularly at certain times when famine struck or epidemics coursed across the region. For example, in 1873, 1874, 40,000 square kilometers of central Anatolia were affected by drought and famine, with somewhere between 150 and 250,000 people dying and flocks of sheep and goat being absolutely decimated. Of course, no one was really counting. I mean, who was going to count precise figures at that time in those regions? No one was. So these figures are only estimates of how many people died. Now, the government could try to reform the provincial administration, one thing on paper, to send out instructions to provincial authorities to change the way they were doing things. Another thing to make sure that it was done, because if we look at even from the Sultan himself, Hamid, in the late 19th century, would complain frequently about the fact that his officials in the eastern provinces would not do what he was asking them to do. They would not follow instructions. And every traveller who went through the land, generally speaking, would talk about corruption, venality, and incompetence and negligence in the provincial administration. How to change all that was going to be difficult. It could not be done overnight, because where did the real power lie? Not really with the Sultan. The real power lay with local power holders who had a strong capacity to obstruct and to resist and to maintain things the way they had always been done and how they worked in their favour. There was an important question here for me about the absolutism of the Sultan. We know that this is a word we connect with Sultan Abdülhamid, and we know what it means. That absolutism in this case means a form of government which is from the top down, one person at the top. No, it's not constitutional government. You don't have a parliament, you just have one person, and from the palace the orders are being issued, and that's it. But I think absolutism might indicate something a bit bigger than that to a lot of people who think about the word. Doesn't mean that the Sultan Abdülhamid had absolute control over the whole of the empire. And the answer to that is that no, he didn't. His control over the empire was not absolute. The Sultan did not have the money or the material means to impose his wishes on the eastern provinces in particular, and certainly not as closely as he could in the western provinces that were close to the capital. The governors were in their konak, appointed by him, but as I've said, much real power, including the power to obstruct and delay, lay elsewhere, particularly with the tribal chiefs and the sheikhs. Now, Abdülhamid is a very intriguing figure. We're still waiting for the proper biography to be written of this figure in European history. It has not yet appeared, despite the passage of time. So Abdülhamid made no attempt to kind of crack down on the Kurdish tribes in particular. They were a frequent cause of complaint by foreign consuls and missionaries. He couldn't do it. If he had even tried to do it, there would have been turmoil in the eastern provinces. What he actually did was to develop a form of social contract in which he did things for the Kurds. He recognized their traditional rights, their territorial prerogatives, in return for them accepting his sovereign rights and doing things for him, connected with maintaining law and order, maybe collecting taxes, so forth and so on. So it was a system that actually worked really, really quite well until the foreign powers began to interfere and more or less upset the apple cart. In this chapter, I also look at relations between Kurds and Armenians, the Kurds being the main ethnic group, I think, in the region, and the Armenians. And I look at the traditional problems that arose between migratory tribes and a sedentary population that's over such issues as stock pasturage and kishlak, which was the traditional accommodation given by villagers to Kurds when they moved down to the plains. And these problems had been going on for a long, long period of time. Now, the intervention of the powers, and especially Britain, in the late 19th century, on the side of the Armenians, in their references to Armenia, in a land that was more than 80% Muslim, and in regions that were largely populated by Kurds, greatly raised the suspicion of the Sultan and his ministers and of the Kurds. Why are they doing this? Why are they calling this region Armenia? The Sultan himself called the region Kurdistan. He called it Kurdistan. Why are they calling this region Armenia? What is going on? They say they want change. They say they're supporting reform. What is it they're really after? And his suspicion was that what they were really after was autonomy, a form of autonomy for the Armenian Christians. And this was also the attitude of the Kurds. They also were very suspicious, and what they thought was that what the outside powers are planning to do is to take what our country, what they regarded as their land, away from them under their noses. Now, what we see happening in this region, on top of all the problems I've described, the kind of the day-to-day problems in a region, the eastern provinces I'm talking about, with badly in need of change, badly in need of development. On top of this came foreign intervention from the 1870s onwards, largely in support of the Armenians. Now, what we see here is an early form of responsibility to protect, a modern phrase, which is intervention in the affairs of another state, ostensibly governed by humanitarian concern. And there was genuine concern, identification in Britain in particular, with the Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire. And this concern was also expressed by the government. But I think we have to, of course, look beyond this and see what the real issue was for a government. And the British government's real interest here was the ambitions of Russia. And if Britain expressed interest in the Christians of the eastern provinces, with talk even of establishing a protectorate over them, the strategic issue underneath that was the need to stop Russia from intervening in the region on the same kind of pretext and making further gains at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, as it had done in the 1870s through war in the Balkans. So the British intervened and tried to impose reforms, they called reforms, on the Sultan. They were not reforms that the Sultan wanted himself. They were specifically designed to privilege one ethnic group against the majority, to privilege the Armenian population against the Muslim majority. And it was completely practical from the start. What the British wanted to do in the first place, this is the late 1870s, was to set up a system of foreign control to foreign inspectors of taxes, of prisons, of courts, of the entire justice system, and so forth and so on. But they did not have the means of doing so. They did not have sufficiently trained officials. And that, of course, included officials who knew Osmanlıca, who could speak to the local people in their own language. They didn't have those officials. Furthermore, although Britain wanted these things, it was not prepared to pay for them. And the Ottoman government itself couldn't pay for them, even if it had been prepared to accept them. And on top of that, Britain had no fallback plan. If this plan we have to change the administration of the eastern provinces in the favor of the Armenians doesn't work, they didn't, what next? Well, they didn't have a fallback plan. And the problem is that over 20 years' time, from the 1870s to the 1890s, the pressure that the British kept putting on the Sultan did not work, and finally came to an end. And that coincided with Britain's own changing strategic priorities. Britain's concern in the period between the 1870s and the 1890s actually increasingly was swinging towards Africa. And by the 1890s, it had really not much interest left for the time being in the Ottoman Empire. And at that point, we see a complete parting of the ways between strategic interests and humanitarian concern. The British kind of walked away from a problem, the Armenian problem, or the Armenian question, which they themselves had largely helped to create since the 1870s. Anyway, in chapter 3, I'll have to hurry a little bit. I can see I'm going to run out of time. I look at what happened in that period of history, those 20 years after the Congress of Berlin. I look at the breakdown of communal relations between Muslims and Christians and between Kurds and Armenians after the Congress of Berlin, which marked the end of the 1877-78 war, in the 20 years from that time up to the 1890s. And I look at how, encouraged by foreign intervention, Armenian activists and committees thought there could be a chance of direct foreign intervention, maybe even military intervention, to force the Ottoman government to accept what they wanted. And we see this spiral of violence developing from the late 1870s and reaching a peak in the 1890s, first of all in the Sassoon district around Mush. Now, what happened at Mush was fundamentally an uprising, which was stoked by Armenian activists, Russian Armenian activists coming to the region, seeing possibilities for stoking an insurrection there and going ahead. Now, even now, there's no kind of unanimity on what actually happened in that region in 1894. There was conflict. There was an uprising. The uprising was crushed by the Ottoman army. The way this was played out in the British media was an unprovoked attack by the Kurds and by the Ottoman by the Kurds and the Ottoman army on innocent Christian villages. Gladstone jumped into the fray and made the most inflammatory remarks about what was going on, gave figures for the numbers of dead that they exceeded the number of people who actually lived in the region. What actually happened there, if we look at these two views, the British view of what happened around Sassoon in 1894 basically came from missionaries and came from foreign consuls, none of them were actually in the region. They were well away from the region. They were forming their reports on what they were being told, very distant from the region. The second report comes from, the second account of what happened there comes from the military archives. And it's quite interesting that just about all the books that have been written that deal with this subject, virtually none of them deal with the military archive. So if we look at the military record, what we actually see happening in 1894 is a day-by-day account from commanders in the field of what was going on in the field, their estimates of the number of insurgents, their estimates of the number of troops they would need to put the insurgency down, how the insurgents were moving, how well armed they were, so forth and so on. All of this changing according to the information they were receiving day after day. And to me, this is a much more reliable way of looking at what actually happened, what really happened in Sassoon, than what was coming through the British press fed by missionaries and consuls who were nowhere near the scene of the action. Now, if we look at the official inquiry that was held into Sassoon, the Ottoman official inquiry, foreign observers were allowed to take part. Now, the foreign observers, if we look at the figures given by the official figures, they amount to a total of just under 400 people dead. So probably 150 civilians and more than 200 Armenian insurgents and some soldiers. If we look at the figures put out by the foreign consuls, we concentrate on Consul Shipley. Consul Shipley at the time said that in his estimate, slightly over 225 Armenians were killed. In 1895, a year after the inquiry was held, he raised this figure and said, actually, what I think what happened at Sassoon was the figure of the number of dead could be as high as 900. So if we take the highest estimate of what happened at Sassoon in that period of history in 1894, given by the representative of a government that was by no means sympathetic to the Ottoman government, Consul Shipley's estimate in 1895 was that perhaps as many as 900 people were killed at Sassoon. The Ottoman figure would have amounted to something less than 400. How is it that more than a century later, the number of dead at Sassoon is still being given in books being published by prestigious university presses as about 3,000? 3,000. That is the figure generally given. It's completely not borne out at all by the facts on the ground, particularly the facts coming from the military record. Anyway, after looking at these events, these kind of rolling violence that spread across the eastern provinces until the 1890s, which ended finally with Britain more or less retreating. It could do no more. It had intervened. It didn't have a workable plan of action in the first place. It didn't have a fallback position. And by the 1896, it simply turned its back and said, there's no more we can do. And it concentrated on areas of greater return and of greater strategic interest at that time, which fundamentally was Africa. In the next chapter, the next couple of chapters, I look at what happened in the Balkans. I look at two wars. The war of 1877-78 and the war of 1912-1913. Now you can read European histories. These epic tragedies, as they were for the Muslim population, virtually had no place. They skated over, and the reader who wants to know what really happened won't find out what happened in any of these histories. The phrase I have to repeat is these were an epic tragedy for the Muslim population. They have no place, these events, in books on genocide and ethnic cleansing. And definitely they were both examples of ethnic cleansing on a mass scale, the cleansing of the Muslim population. The word used by the British ambassador, Sir Henry Layard, during the 1877-78 war, when describing the activities of the Russian army and the Bulgarians, was extermination. That's the word used in his dispatches. The tools of the exterminationist trade being massacre, rape, destruction of villages, of mosques, cemeteries, tombs, libraries, with village after village being set on fire and the flames being seen for miles. The British MP, Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, who was actually pro-Turkish or pro-Ottoman, calculated that of the 2 million Muslims who lived in Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia, which was a semi-independent kind of, but still a province still under Ottoman control, of those 2 million people, in his estimate, only 555,000 remained after the war. The others had been killed or driven out. The scenes on the way to Istanbul were shocking, appalling. I don't hesitate to describe them because I don't believe in skating over history. I think the readers want to know the detail. They might be disturbing, but they're entitled to know what actually happened. Refugees dying on the way to Istanbul, freezing to death in their wagons, dying of cholera, dying of malnutrition, dying of exposure. If they reached Istanbul, mosques and public buildings turned into makeshift hospitals and clinics to look after them. I mean, a truly immense tragedy for the Muslim population of the Balkans, which so far has not been given its due in histories. After that war, and here if I could ask Hazel to show map number 2, if she could, map number 2, will show the situation of the Ottoman Empire, the shrinkage of the empire after the war. There's a pre-war map and there's a post-war map. If she shows map number 2, see how the empire had been reduced after the war of 1877-78. Now, the war of 1912-1913 was more or less a repeat of the war of 1877-78. It was a well-planned, well-prepared and coordinated attack by 4 Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro. It resulted in disaster for the Ottomans on the battlefield and another catastrophe for the Muslim civilian population. The center of the war was Macedonia. And the scenes from that war were basically a repeat of what happened in 1877-78. An immense outflow of refugees, again with many dying of cholera, malnutrition, or exposure on the way to Istanbul, or too ill to survive when they arrived. The fact is, this was, even though Macedonia had been in turmoil with uprisings and plans for reform by the outside powers that actually never really took final shape. And with the Ottoman government itself trying to control the situation, trying to introduce its own reforms, and also trying to put down uprisings, it was a very kind of volatile situation. But the whole, but indeed, the attack of 1912 was an unprovoked war of aggression, which had two aims: territorial expansion by the Balkan states and the extirpation of the Ottoman Muslim presence in Macedonia. So what we see happening in Bulgaria in 1877-78 was repeated in Macedonia and other surrounding regions in 1912-1913. It was a war of unprovoked aggression. Britain had said aggression would be punished, but in fact, it was rewarded. Greece expanded its territory. It more than doubled its territory in that war. The other states also gained. Some of them lost because in 1913, like dogs fighting over the bones of a body, they fell out. They fell out. Bulgaria and Greece in particular, and Serbia, and some of the gains that Bulgaria had made in particular were lost. The Carnegie Report gives reports on the atrocities carried out by these states. When Arnold Toynbee came to Istanbul in 1921, many of the refugees from that war were still living in mosques. So it was, once again, it was the second kind of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans in 30 to 40 years, which still does not have its place in European histories of the period. Okay, if we can show map 3, we can see how the Ottoman Empire was further reduced after the War of 1912-1913. Now this war had already been preceded by another war. In 1911, Libya had been invaded by Italy. And again, this aggressive attack was allowed by the powers. They didn't raise a finger to stop it. I think the attitude of the dominant powers, Britain in particular, was that Italy was a rising imperial power. It was entitled to join the club. It was entitled to have its place in the sun. And if you looked at where it could kind of plant its flag in Africa, there wasn't all that much territory left because most of it had been taken. Libya on the Mediterranean coast was about the only place left. Egypt had gone, Tunisia had gone, Morocco had gone, Algeria had gone to the French, so forth and so on. So in 1911, Italy invaded Libya. It took very quickly control of the coastal littoral. It could not get into the interior. It was blocked month after month by tribal resistance and by the participation of the Ottoman army officers, of course, including Mustafa Kemal. So to put pressure on the Ottoman government, the Italians began taking military action elsewhere. They bombed Beirut. The Navy bombed Beirut, destroyed ships in the harbour, killed people in the city, then bombed the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. It bottled up shipping in the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara for weeks, therefore raised, this time they did raise the concern of the powers because the commercial interests, their commercial interests were now affected by what was going on in the war. Italy also occupied the southern Aegean islands. They were never to be returned to their rightful owner, the Ottoman government. The only question for the powers was who should really have them. Should it be Italy or should it be Greece? The issue of them being returned to the Ottoman government never even came up for debate. They were going to be held, taken away from the Ottoman government and given either to Italy or to Greece. So the hypocrisy and the deceit and the double dealing of the European powers over this period of history from the late 19th century up to the end of the Balkans War actually needs no elaboration here. Italy was stuck in Libya, losing more soldiers every day, unable to bring the war to an end, unable to really pay for the war. All of this came to an end when the four Balkan states attacked the Ottoman Empire in 1912. The Ottomans had to quickly bring an end to the situation in Libya and to agree to an end to the war, because it had now to deal with the next war, the one coming from the Balkans. I deal with the rise of the Young Turks. I look at the revolution of 1908 and the counter-revolution. I look at the so-called Adana incidents, when there was turmoil in Adana between Armenian Christians and the local Muslim population, which had nothing to do with what was going on in Istanbul. It was not something that had been set up by the Ottoman government. It was a spontaneous explosion in an area that had been growing increasingly tense. I look at how the situation in Istanbul was exploited from the outside, how on October 5, 1908, Bulgaria declared its independence over Eastern Rumelia, which was an area that was still nominally a province of the Ottoman Empire, and how Ferdinand, the Bulgarian ruler, declared himself as Tsar. I looked at how the very next day, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, October the 6th. Nothing was done to stop that. Britain was angry at what Austria had done, but only because Austria had violated the Treaty of Berlin, and according to which any changes in the political situation in the Balkans were only to be made on the basis of general agreement between all those powers involved. Once again, the fact that this territory had been snatched out of the hands of the Ottoman government was not up for debate. Austria-Hungary got away with it. Now, what were the aims of the Young Turks? Now, we read a lot about how they were dominated by Turkification, the determined attempt to Turkify the empire. In my view, looking at what I was able to read, their aim was to hold the empire together. They were an eclectic bunch anyway. Many complications. The Arab component of the empire, the Arabs of Syria, certainly wanted decentralization. Macedonians, Christians, Armenians were opting out. Even by 1911, 1912, Albania had declared its independence. So there's kind of 2 points here. Were the Christian components of the empire being driven out of the empire, out of the body politic, or were they actually choosing to go? It seems to me that looking at the statements of their leaders, their political leaders, their committees, they were choosing to leave the Ottoman body politic, not so much driven out. So if the Ottoman Empire became more Turkish, it was because many of the components, the ethnic components of the empire, no longer wanted to be part. The Ottoman idea, I think if I can sum this up, by that stage clearly had failed. The idea arising in the late 19th century, what we need is an Ottoman sense of identity that will transcend all other senses of identity. We can say that by 1911, 1912, it had failed. The people wanted to break away. They wanted a different future. So there was kind of an impetus towards a more ethnically consolidated Ottoman lands. I then look at the First World War, and maybe we can look at the map 5, which shows the Ottoman Empire in 1914. Here, I'm getting to the heart of my book, finally, having set out what I see as being essential to understand the conditions prevailing in the empire up to 1914. And here I look at the war, and the first point I would like to make here is that the Ottoman Empire was a pre-modern and pre-industrial state fighting a modern war. The European states were modern states for the time. They had transport networks, they had railway networks, they had large supplies of weaponry, they had everything an army would need. The civilian population had everything a modern civilian population at that time would need. Ottoman Empire had none of these things. It was a pre-modern, pre-industrial state fighting a modern war. And I think that's important to understand when looking at the military campaigns in particular across the empire. I look at the antecedents to the war, especially Britain's seizure of warships being built for the Ottoman government in British shipyards. I look at briefly at the attack by Admiral Suchan and the Ottoman fleet on Russian positions in the Black Sea, which pulled the Ottoman Empire into the war. whether it liked to be in the war or not, and there was opposition to that inside the cabinet. I very briefly sketched the military successes at Gallipoli and Kut, and the failures at Sarıkamış, and I look at the role of the special organisation, the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa. But my fundamental approach here, these are only threads that hold the narrative together, is to look at the fate of the civilian population. Now, this was an absolute epic saga. Again, an epic saga which has virtually no place in European histories and is still under-researched even in Turkey, where bookshops, as I've said, have endless books on campaigns and generals, but little on what happened to the civilians apart from the suffering of soldiers. A couple of books have come out in the last couple of years, one by Yiğit Akın, When the War Came Home, which looks at the fate of the civilian population in Anatolia and Istanbul, and a book by Leyla Fawaz, which looks at what happened to the civilian population in Syria. These books are both of them are far from complete, but they begin what I would hope to be an interest by researchers in looking not so much at the campaigns, the military campaigns, but looking at what happened to the civilians, because we're looking at something that was really quite shocking at the time. Epidemics, malnutrition, disease took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Military requisitioning drove even the middle class into poverty. I look at the position of women in the city, some of them, because of the destitution that became more widespread as the war went on. Some were driven into prostitution. Women in the country were left to run the farm. They had to look after old people. They had to look after the cropping. They had to look after children. They had to deliver requisitioned grain and other produce to military depots. They were also subject to mistreatment, being women alone, their husbands, their sons, whomever, off at the war front. They were subject to mistreatment by predatory males, which was one reason why many Ottoman soldiers deserted, because they didn't like their families being exposed in such a fashion. And these women, and Yiğit Akın observes this in his book, many of these women let their feelings be known. They complained, they sent messages to the Ottoman government. What do you think you're doing? You know, we can't deal with the situation. We can't do all the things you're asking us to do. We have to survive. We have to look after children. We have to look after old people. How do you expect us to deliver grain, to give you what you want? We need it for ourselves. So there's a lot on this and a lot more to be found out about how women dealt with the pressure of the war. In Syria, the situation was greatly worsened by the locust plague of 1915 and the Allied naval blockade of the Mediterranean coast. This is a subject that I hope someone listening, a PhD student looking for a research topic, might be interested in developing, because nothing so far has been done on the consequences of the Allied naval blockade of the Mediterranean coast. Nothing could come in, nothing could get out. All the spare parts you would need for your irrigation needs, you couldn't export any of the things that were exported formerly. You didn't have, because these were cash economies and seasonal economies, you picked your crops and you exported them straight away, or you moved them to other parts of the empire. Your tobacco, whatever it might be, your grain, your fruit, your silk from the mountains of Lebanon. But once all this stopped by the Navy blockade, there were no storage depots, nothing, there was not sufficient transport overland to move produce to where it would have to go to. So a lot of it simply rotted where it was harvested. Conditions were shocking. The cash economies were killed off, and as a result of that, famine spread very quickly across Syria. George Antonius, the Arab historian, has estimated that perhaps 500,000 people died in Syria because of the famine of 1915, and the Allied naval blockade was a large cause of that famine by preventing by killing off the local economies. People were dropping dead. I go into this in my book. I go into the actual details of the suffering. I feel it necessary to describe what was actually happening in the mountains of Mount Lebanon. Villages were being depopulated. People were dropping dead every day in the streets of Beirut and Damascus. It was an overall terrible situation. From there, I move on to a very critical question, a very difficult one, as we all know, which is the Armenian issue. I look at this in two chapters. One is entitled The Armenians in Arms, provocative, as it might be to some people, but it looks at the preparations that the Armenians were making for insurgency from the late 19th century onwards. And then I look at the relocation of 1915, when a large bulk of the Armenian population was moved. So if we can turn to map 4, we can then see the eastern provinces, which is the center of the things I talk about in this chapter. And in this chapter, I talk about Armenian uprisings and insurgencies behind the Ottoman lines in 1915, which I connect up with the near decimation of the Third Army during the Sarıkamış campaign in early 1915. The Third Army was responsible for the security and defense of northeastern Anatolia. It was decimated in the campaign at Sarıkamış. It could not restore its manpower. It could not provide security to the area for which it was responsible. It had to try to block Russian invasion. It had to protect the civilian population. It had to stem attacks from behind the lines by insurgents. It simply didn't have the means to do that. So there's a whole 6-month period from the beginning of 1915 to what happened in Van in April and May, which I connect up with what happened at Sarıkamış early in the year. Now, the Van uprising has been whitewashed in many histories. It's presented as an act of defense. Well, whether it was defense or whether it was a voluntary uprising against the Ottoman army, which I think is the case, from the standpoint of the military command, the Ottoman military command, it was a disaster, because an important provincial city close to the Russian lines had been taken over by Armenian insurgents and then handed over to the Russians. Now, in this process, the Armenians, and this is something you will not find in any of the histories except for ones written by such eminent scholars as Justin McCarthy and a few others, the Armenians engaged in an orgy of killing in the town and the nearby lake. Thousands upon thousands of people were killed. This has been whitewashed in the histories coming out of books written by people I'd prefer to describe as propagandists rather than historians. They looted, they killed, they tried to create such a situation in Van that the Muslims would not even want to return. And we know what they were after because their own writings, Aram Manukian, who was the short-term head of the Van Republic, made it clear that the goal in that region was extermination, especially of the Kurds. They wanted to get rid of the Kurds. This is the word he uses. This word was also used in the diaries of Russian officers describing the brutality of Armenian insurgents elsewhere. So I follow what happened from that point on, from the Van uprising, not just what happened in the region, the massive flight out of Muslim refugees, tens of thousands of them, the killing of thousands in and around the lake. And by no means do I mean to exclude the communal fighting that was also had been taking place over months between Muslims and Armenians. But I describe what happened at Van. I then describe what happened as a result and the arrests of Armenians, several hundred Armenians, committee members and sympathizers in Istanbul on April the 24th, which of course is the day that the Armenians mark as the beginning of their genocide. The human rights lawyer Jeffrey Robertson, as I've pointed out in a review of his book, hasn't been taken to Ankara by ship. Maybe he knew that they were only going across the Sea of Marmara, but the way this comes out in his book is that they were taken to Ankara by ship. According to the journalist Robert Fisk, who died recently, and I don't quote this in the book, but I'll mention it because it's an example of some of the propaganda that's been in circulation. These hundreds of arrested people were taken off the train just outside Ankara, were led to pre-dug graves, were shot in the head and dumped in them. This is a complete untruth. I don't know where Fisk got this from, but in fact, the arrested Armenians were moved in two groups, one to Çankırı and the other to Ayaş. Many of the Çankırı detainees were released in a few months, And according to Yusuf Saranay, who's done the research, all the IS detainees survived the war except for one who had died. Some of those in Çankırı who stayed in Çankırı then moved on to Syria, and according to Armenian histories, some were massacred on the way to Damascus. So their fate was not a good one, but it doesn't correspond with the description given by Robert Fisk and picked up by other people. I refer to the commissions of inquiry and the trials of late 1915, 1916, as reports came back to the Ottoman government that the Armenian convoys being moved after the Van uprising, after the relocation had been decided, were being attacked. So the commissions of inquiry and the trials of that period result in death sentences or imprisonment for many of those accused of mistreating the Armenians. So this raises an interesting question for those who take up who look at the position of an Ottoman government that was bent on destruction of the Armenian community. If it were bent on their destruction, why would be putting people involved in mistreating the Armenians on trial? Why would it be sentencing many to death? Why would it be putting many others in prison? There's an obvious contradiction here. These trials, by the way, are far more important than the trials held in Istanbul in 1918, 1919 under the aegis of occupying powers. Those trials have been given a lot of attention. These trials, the ones I'm talking about, have still no place in most histories that you will read. I go into the orders for the relocation, which was taken after the arrest of the Armenians on April 24th, towards the end of May. The military had recommended the only way we can deal with the insurgent situation is to remove the civilian population. In other words, to give us a clear space to get at the insurgents. Now, this is not all that uncommon in warfare. In many, many wars, a suspect population is removed. It's been happened in many countries. It happened in Cuba. It happened in the Philippines. It happened in Vietnam. It happened in Algeria. It happened in Malaya under the British in the 1940s. So it's not uncommon. So, but in the Ottoman case, it turned out badly. There's lots of kind of questions to be asked here that I really can't answer. Talat has been demonized. Talat was the one who issued the orders. Even if the recommendation came from the military, it was Talat who, as the minister responsible, had to issue the orders. Now, we can look at the situation, and if we take into account every single thing I've said about conditions of the eastern provinces, it's very clear that even in peacetime, it would have been very, very difficult to remove such a large number of people, 500,000 perhaps, safely. How would you do it in war, when your back is against the wall, when you're fighting on several fronts, when your transport facilities are the first priority goes to the army, when there's not enough food to go around, when health facilities are limited? It's going to be very, very difficult. So one question in my mind, and one I can't answer because it doesn't appear in the archives, not so far as I know, is whether someone came up to Talat and said, look, Talat, we can't do this. This is going to be too difficult. We don't have the facilities to organize this properly. And I wonder what his response would have been. We have to do it. We have to do it. The army command says we have to do it, because if we don't do it, the insurgencies behind the lines are so serious, they could cost us the whole war. We have to do it. We know the results of the relocation. The Armenians, most of them went by land. Many were killed on the way. Their convoys were attacked. A large number were killed. Others died in Syria once they got there. Many were massacred. Others died from exposure, from malnutrition, from disease. So it was a shocking outcome, although practically speaking, as Edward Eriksson has observed, the clearing away of the civilian population actually allowed the military to crush the insurgents. So this is this grey area. Talat has been accused of deliberately sending people to their death. He denies it, and I take him at his word. I think my position would be that he was the minister. And even if he didn't know what the consequences of the decisions he was taking would be, he was the minister, and in line with the theory of ministerial responsibility, I guess he has to be held responsible to a certain degree. Anyway, There's a false binary here. If I look at what happened to the Armenians in that period of history, which is surely terrible, even if we don't agree with some historians on the numbers who died, how they died, so forth and so on, with this an ongoing debate about this. There's one kind of component of this which is entirely missing, which is what happened to the Muslim population. Where are the Muslims in this story? In all these histories that have come out of these university presses in the United States and other countries, where are the Muslims? They were the bulk of the population. Why are they invisible in their history? Why is it that we hear a lot of histories about the fate of the Christians, and even we can agree that their fate was terrible, no matter how much we disagree over the detail? Where are the Muslims? This is what led me to look into this, to write this book in the first place. The Muslim population has been largely invisible. So one purpose I had was to bring them into the light of day, so people would have a more balanced understanding of what happened in the war. It wasn't just the Christians who suffered, it was the Muslims as well. And a large number, a very, very large number died. And they died from exactly the same causes as the Christians. They were massacred in very large numbers. They died from exposure. They died from malnutrition. They died from disease. Epidemics spread across the eastern provinces in particular. They were an incubator for these diseases. There was a huge death toll amongst the Muslim population. So my point here in saying these things is to destroy what I regard as a false binary. And the false binary is that we have the victims of violence on one side, fundamentally the Ottoman Christians, and we have the perpetrators of violence on the other side, fundamentally the Muslims, either as Turks or Kurds. This is completely false. This is completely false. Perpetrators and victims would be found on both sides or in all groups. This distinction between the two might suit the propagandist, but it is misleading and it is an absolute distortion of history. And my aim is to try to correct this and to, as I said, to bring into the light of day and to give them their place in the sun as well, the large numbers of Muslims who died in the war. We don't actually, the figures are naturally suspect. It's very difficult to come to firm conclusions about the numbers of people who died in the war. From everything I've read, which include the demographic work done by Justin McCarthy, extrapolation from what is known from refugees who died, so forth and so on, from the documents that were put together after the war in 18 when the Ottoman military was able to return to the eastern provinces, from known military casualties. My guess or my thinking would be that the total casualties in the empire would be probably something around 4 million. We know that the military casualties came to about 800,000, with more soldiers dying of disease because or malnutrition than actually died in the battlefield. We know that we don't know how many Armenians died. We dispute that. I dispute that. Many historians dispute the figures given by the Armenians. Their figures are a bit robbery too. The number of Muslims died. How many died? How many Muslims were killed in the war who died from all causes? Possibly more than 2 million, maybe 2.5 million. A lot of people. We're talking about a great tragedy. And even when this question is raised in some histories, there's a determined attempt to underplay it. I read one history in which the author, whose name I won't mention, said, "Well, the suffering of the Muslims is not to be compared with the suffering of the Armenians," and then she gives a completely false estimate of the number of Muslims who would have died, and she says, "But the suffering would not have been as great." And the question in my mind is, how do you weigh suffering? How do you weigh suffering? On what basis do you assess suffering? Is it on the basis of numbers? If it's on the basis of numbers, well, far more Muslims died in the war than Ottoman Christians. If it's based on actual physical suffering in the moment up to death, how is someone writing now able to say what that person suffered before their life came to an end? And I find these kind of tactics, these polemical tactics in what should be histories, deeply disturbing and distasteful. It's not something that I personally would ever want to engage in. Anyway, I then move on. Finally, I'm coming towards the end. I know I have to finish very soon. I deal with the post-war period, the onward movement of the Ottoman army towards Baku, which was then the center of international competition, mainly over the oil in the Caspian Sea. All the Caucasian factions, ethnic factions were engaged, Azerbaijanis, the Armenians, the Georgians, the Bolsheviks were engaged, the left revolutionaries, the White Russians, and the British. And the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, the two main ethnic groups, on occasion killed each other. This is a separate issue from the First World War, kind of as a secondary war. But what has happened in many of the histories is that the Armenian losses have been conflated into the wartime losses to give a larger picture of how many Armenians died as a result of the war. But to a degree, these wars, the large war and the secondary war, have to be regarded as somewhat separately. In this chapter, I look at the French occupation of the southeast of Turkey and the attempt by the French colonial commercial lobby to establish a foothold under the pretext of establishing an Armenian protectorate, which is pretty much the same kind of attitude that the British had in the late 19th century with regard to the Armenians, and it didn't work. By this time, the Turkish national resistance had been fully developed, and was able to drive the French out of the southeast. The road to Izmir brings me almost to the end of my book. I deal with the European idealism of Greece and the decision after the war that Greece should have Izmir and not Italy. Those who know the history will know that during the war, wartime promises, Izmir was promised to Italy. But after the war, Britain in particular regarded Italy as being too dangerous, too ambitious, too active in the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean to be allowed to have Izmir, and therefore Greece should have it. So Greece landed the Greek army landed in Izmir in May 1919. It was supposed to occupy only Izmir and its immediate environs, but very quickly broke out and began moving up and down the Aegean coast and to the shores of the Sea of Marmara, and then slowly into the interior. Now, this landing gave tremendous impetus to the Turkish national resistance. The invasion was supported very firmly by Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, who believed almost at the end of this episode that Mustafa Kemal, the commander of the Turkish forces, was a bandit, and the Turkish National Army was a sham. Kemal joked after the war that given Britain's role in kind of pushing or driving or supporting the Greek army into Anatolia, he should, and that was the impetus for the consolidation of a national movement. So what you had before was spontaneous resistance to the Greeks after the landing, or to Allied occupation. After the landing, what you had was the consolidation of a national movement. So Mustafa Kemal joked after the war that perhaps he should build a statue to David Lloyd George, put up in the centre of Ankara as the man who, in his own kind of way, helped to foment the Turkish national movement. The Greek campaign was marked by atrocities against the civilian population. Here, let me mention very quickly, this is the third war that Greece had launched against the Ottoman Empire. First was in 1897, when Greece instigated a revolt on Crete. The second was the War of 1912-1913. This is the third war, the third time Greece had attacked the Ottoman Empire. These figures, these sequences are not put together in many histories of this period. I think it doesn't suit the interest of many historians to see it this way. Certainly, this is certainly the way I see it. Right? The Greek army and the civilians following in the wake of the Greek army committed many, many, many atrocities, terrible atrocities. The Inter-Allied Commission of Inquiry, which was set up by the Allied powers occupying Ottoman lands, Istanbul and other parts of the empire, they inquired into these atrocities. They sent a commission to travel and file what they found. That report was handed to the Supreme Council in Paris in November, never published. This is in 1919, because its findings were too embarrassing to Greece and to the governments that backed the invasion. In 1921, a more limited report was published, which referred to a systematic plan of destruction of Muslim villages and the extinction of the Muslim population. That is the language that's actually used in this Commission's report, this one that was published. The representative of the International Red Cross, who travelled with commissioners, referred even, in his words, to a plan of extermination. Why do these events have no place in European histories of this period of history and of what was going on in Ottoman lands? You know, when historians write about the consequences of the peace that was being formulated in Paris. Arnold Toynbee also used the word extermination. Toynbee came to Istanbul in 1929, made his own investigation. After witnessing the destruction along the Aegean coast and the Sea of Marmara, he also used that word extermination. And although he was critical of the Turks and Turkish National Force, there's no doubt at all that the main focus of his report was what the Greeks were doing. This report was published. I think it had to be published. But the British, one has to think of why does the government publish a report? They must have some reason behind it. The British had no option really. I think what they tried to do with this report was to kind of balance out the picture by referring largely to past allegations against the Turks, not present allegations. The Greek atrocities were happening or had just happened. To kind of paint a more ostensibly balanced picture, the report referred back frequently to past actions alleged against the Turkish National Forces. Now, Mustafa Kemal took this up in a parliamentary speech when he talked about why are they raising this question of atrocities being committed against the Armenians now when we know no atrocities are being committed against them. It's very clear what he had in his mind was that they're doing this to take attention away from the Greeks are doing. Now, according to the author, Taner Akşam, this is the title of the book he wrote, Mustafa Kemal described the genocide, in quotes, as a shameful act. In fact, Akşam has, in my understanding, my limited understanding of Osmanlıca, Akşam has mixed up the Ottoman word for a specific shameful act or deed, which is faziha, with a word Ataturk actually used, which is fazihat, fazihat or fazahat, which has only the general meaning of shame or disgrace. Mustafa Kemal could never have referred to genocide, as Akşam says, because the word had not yet been coined. It wasn't to be coined until the 1940s. Neither did he use the phrase shameful act. He referred only to the shame, in a general sense, of the early stages of the war, whatever he meant by that. Even if he did have the fate of the Armenians in mind, he didn't specifically connect them up. Anyway, the concealment of the atrocities committed by the Greek army all the way back the Aegean coast and the gross inflation of casualties after the return to Izmir of the Ottoman army fit into a well-entrenched pattern of deceit and misrepresentation that characterizes the way these events have been depicted in many histories. Anyway, in the final chapter, End of the Line, I described David Lloyd George's last stand at Çanakkale, gone into the British histories as the Çanak crisis, and his failed attempt to persuade Commonwealth governments to come and fight a new war, this time against the Turks. The Turks had defeated all their enemies at this point. It was an extraordinary achievement, one has to say, by the Turkish National Forces. They'd taken on the French and defeated them. It stopped an Armenian state being established in northeast Anatolia. And finally, after a terrible war, another war after the one just finished, they had defeated the Greek army and sent the Greek army running back towards the coast and committing atrocities all the way, burning towns as they went. France had already kind of seen the light of day and had kind of was engaging with the national government in Ankara. Italy was out of the picture. The last standing man in this picture was Britain, and in particular David Lloyd George. He was not going to retreat. He was not going to give in to the pressures of the nationalists. He was going to fight another war if necessary. So he contacted the Commonwealth governments, please send troops. They all said no. There's a very nice dispatch from the Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, which I reproduce in my book. You know, we would fight a war with a genuine cause, but the one you want, it doesn't have a genuine cause. And quite frankly, we're sick of war. David Lloyd George even approached Romania and the Yugoslav state in being. Can you please send troops? We'll give you concessions over access to the straits. They didn't buy that. So this was a huge, humiliating failure for Britain and for David Lloyd George in particular, which led to his resignation, the end of the war in Greece, a calamity, the great idea, which was the motive force, the expansion of Greek territory from the late 19th century onwards, had come to a calamitous end at the hands of the Turkish Nationalist Army, and Greek cabinet ministers and generals who launched this war were shot. Map 6, which you don't need to show, which is there anyway, shows modern Turkey as it emerged from this very, very difficult and shocking period of history. So I finished here, but I would like to raise a few questions of my own, ahead of some questions that some of you might like to ask. How is it that so much of what I have in my book and what I've tried to compress in this talk today is not to be found in the histories? And in particular, I'd raise the fate of the Muslim civilian population of the empire in the Balkans and in Anatolia, a huge number of people. And in fact, would extend that to include the Muslims who were moved from the Crimea, or fled from the Crimea, or driven out, or felt they didn't want to live there anymore after Russian occupation, or from the Caucasus. We don't have a precise figure on this, but Kamal Karpat, the figures range from 5 to 7 million people, from roughly about the Crimean War to the end of the First World War. 5 to 7 million people being driven out of these lands, either being driven out ahead of military conquest, or feeling such pressure brought upon them that they don't want to be there anymore anyway, and they leave. So there's a huge outflow of refugees into the Ottoman lands, which has demographic consequences for the territories they've left and for the territories in which they're now coming. So how is it that so much of this is not in the histories, in particular the suffering of the civilians? How is it, I'm frequently puzzled by what I see as, I can't really quite explain it, the negligence of publishers and editors. I see things appearing in histories that have no basis in fact. I see false claims being made. I see claims being made without footnotes, without any substantiation. And I wonder, how is this possible in a book coming out from a prestigious university press that no one is saying to the author, can you please back up this claim? Where is the footnote? Where is the source? No. Often there are no sources, there are no footnotes. A claim is made on a page, and that's the end of the story. I would not dare even attempt to do such a thing. I no doubt I've made many mistakes, but I do my best to make sure that every single thing I write has a solid source, that the reader can see, can find. If I give one example from a book that came out of Oxford University Press, just one example. And this person was taking the traditional view of Hamid, the Sultan Hamid, whom I regard as a very interesting figure to be studied in the light of his time and in the circumstances of his time, and not in hindsight. And this person, this author, claimed that Hamid had a policy of massacre. Well, he didn't have a policy of massacre. There's no such thing as a policy of massacre. How is it that one of the most prestigious university presses in the world can allow such a claim to pass into a book without someone asking a question? Where is the evidence? Where's your footnote? Where's the proof? Where's the document? No, nothing. And this is only one example. One could go through and name hundreds of them. There is a reluctance, it seems to me, by editors to challenge what has already been ingrained in the mainstream narrative, which is what my book does. It's a deliberate attempt by my part, it's only secondary, but I set out to write the history as I saw it. That's what any historian should only do. That's what they should do. This is what I think is truth. I'm not saying it is the truth. It's what I think is the true picture of what's happening. But the secondary, what also I thought would happen was that if this book can be published, enough people can read it, it might have some impact in changing the way people see late Ottoman history. I that remains to be seen. The book has only been out for a year. I don't know how many copies are being sold. I've only seen a couple of reviews so far, but there is a general reluctance by book publishers, journal editors, to challenge the mainstream narrative. And we all know why, because if you challenge the mainstream narrative, particularly on some of these questions on the Greek aspect of this story, or the Ottoman Christian aspect of this story, or the Armenian aspect of this story, you're going to find yourself being pushed into a corner. If you're the author of an article that takes that line, you might not be published. If you're an editor who does publish an article that takes that line, you might be pushed into the same category, so you steer clear of it and you play it safe. You just repeat what has already been said many times over. So what is needed? How do we rebalance the narrative? I've done my part. We need to encourage young scholars to take this on. And I know why they don't. I know perfectly well why they don't, because it's immensely costly for their reputations. If you research some of these aspects of this history and you take up a position that goes against the mainstream narrative, your academic career will be nobbled before it's even started. If you won't get a job overseas. You won't get a job at an American university or a British university if you are defined as somehow the trite phrase, when we come to the Armenian question, is a Holocaust denier. So this, in fact, this word denial should never be in history. History has to remain open. By using the word denial, you're saying that I'm right, you're wrong. No more argument. How's this word? How can this word be used by a genuine historian? How can it be used? It shouldn't be. Every historical question should remain open. But young scholars, I feel, understand what lies ahead of them if they want to take on some of these very, very controversial questions. It can ruin their academic careers before they're even started. What we need to do, I think, before you ask a few questions, Veron, is we need to allow completely independent research in this country, whatever the findings. We need some support for young scholars who are prepared to step forward and do completely pure research. And we need to allow them to come up with whatever findings they might make. That shouldn't be an issue. They could support what you believe. They could support what I believe. They can go against what I believe or what you believe. It doesn't really matter as long as they're doing their job. And if they support what we do believe, well, that's great. But they should not feel under constraints to come up with a certain understanding of history. Short-term polemics are not the answer to this situation. We're not going to turn around these unbalanced narratives by engaging in short-term polemics. They might be good in the short term, you know, they might satisfy the appetite, but we need something long-term to deal with this problem of the narrative that's been established in the Western cultural mainstream, a very distorted one in my view, and probably in the view of most of you as well, and one that actually is badly in need of correction. How do we correct it? How do we do it? You know, my book is an attempt to do this. I have no idea what impact it might have. Maybe none, maybe a little bit. And where do we get support from? We need money, we need funding, we need research positions, we need maybe a research centre to engage in pure research. We need support. The private sector could be approached. Maybe the private sector could help. We don't need the government. We don't need government control. We don't need the control of anyone. We need scholars to feel free to do their research without someone looking over their shoulder, and without feeling that there is a conclusion that they must reach. This has done a lot of damage to research on this question. So at the moment, the arguments that I would put forward on these questions, the arguments that you would put forward on these questions, many of them being lost by default, because we don't have, or we people who share the same view about the mainstream narrative and realise that it doesn't really stand up to close scrutiny. At the moment, our arguments are being lost by default. Okay, that's all I have to say, and I would welcome